Marcus, a 38-year-old graphic designer living alone in a cramped apartment in Detroit, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his monotonous days. His small kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee and lingering humidity seeping through the cracks of the window frames. Outside, the relentless drizzle blurred the city lights into streaks of melancholy. He sat at his desk, reviewing color palettes, when he felt it, a faint, almost dismissible itch just above his right knee. He brushed it with his hand, only to feel a subtle hardness beneath the skin, something almost like a small pebble embedded under his flesh. He frowned, shaking his head, attributing it to a mosquito bite or perhaps a minor scrape from the park bench he had sat on earlier. The skin around the spot was slightly warmer than the rest of his leg, almost pulsing beneath his touch. Marcus tried to ignore it, flexing his knee as if movement could reset his nerves. At work, he noticed the irritation worsening, an occasional prickling sensation like tiny pinpricks spreading in irregular patterns up his thigh. His colleagues, cheerful in the gray-lit office, laughed at trivial jokes, oblivious to the creeping dread crawling across his skin. During lunch, he pulled up his pant leg under the table, expecting to see nothing. Yet there it was, a small, reddish-black mark, the surface glistening unnaturally, as though moisture wept from a wound that wasn't there before. He recoiled slightly, heart racing, and pressed a napkin against it, feeling the subtle wetness stick to his fingers. The smell was faint but metallic, tangy, like rust mixed with iron. Marcus swallowed hard, attempting to suppress panic, telling himself it was a bruise, an infection from some unknown scratch. Nothing serious. Returning home, he showered, scrubbing vigorously, but the mark refused to vanish, seeming to throb beneath his palm. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the steamed-up mirror and froze. The redness around the blackened center seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. That night, sleep evaded him. The itch had become a creeping crawl, a sensation as if something wriggled just beneath the skin. Each time he shifted under the blankets, he could hear, or imagine, a faint crackling, like bones or cartilage bending and whispering secrets only his body could comprehend. The shadows in the room lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward him, the patter of rain outside, now sounding like dry scratching across the roof. In the darkness, Marcus reached down, and his fingers sank slightly into the knee where the black and red mark had grown, now tender and warm. He felt the grotesque sensation of movement, small, deliberate shifts beneath the flesh, as though something alive stirred inside him. Panic rose in his chest, but he whispered reassurances to himself, refusing to confront the possibility. Yet the soft, irregular thumps beneath his skin, the metallic tang in his nostrils, the sticky moisture that clung to his fingers as he touched the swelling, all pointed to a grim reality he wasn't ready to accept. He sank back against the pillow, trembling, his mind a tangle of denial and horror. Then, in the silence broken only by the rain, a soft, wet squelch echoed faintly, almost like a sigh, from the spot just above his knee. Marcus froze, paralyzed, staring at the shadowed outline of his leg in the dim light, and the realization struck him. This was no ordinary wound. Something was alive beneath the skin. The next morning, Marcus woke with a heavy sense of dread clinging to his chest, the memory of the soft, wet squelch beneath his knee still vivid in his mind. He avoided looking at the mark at first, but as he rolled over in the dim light of his apartment, he could no longer ignore the swelling that had blossomed overnight. The black and red blotch had expanded, the edges irregular, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He tugged at the hem of his pants, revealing a grotesque sight. The skin was now taut and shiny, glistening with a yellowish, viscous fluid that leaked slowly, leaving a sticky trail along his leg. The smell hit him first, a pungent stench of decay, metallic and sour, as if iron and rot had fused into one. Panic surged through him, but he fought it down, telling himself it was just an infection, maybe a nasty bite, anything explainable. At breakfast, his appetite vanished. The thought of food, turning his stomach at the lingering odor, and the gnawing unease that something beneath the skin had its own will. At work, he wore long pants, ignoring the discomfort of the tight fabric over the swollen knee, trying to hide the grotesque transformation. Yet even through the office's fluorescent lighting, he felt every glance on him. Imagine the faint wrinkling of his colleagues' noses at the metallic tang that seemed to cling to his clothes. By mid-afternoon, the itch had turned to burning, a sensation of tiny, persistent needles burrowing under the surface, as if microscopic creatures traced deliberate paths beneath his skin. He adjusted his chair constantly, crossing and uncrossing his legs, every movement sending waves of pain and shivers through him. That evening, alone in his apartment, Marcus dared to inspect the mark closely in the bathroom mirror. The sight froze him with horror. The wound had changed color again. The red deepened into a dark, angry maroon, while streaks of black weaved through it like veins, pulsing visibly with the slow throb of his blood. He noticed that small bubbles of yellow pus surfaced and popped at the edges, releasing that coppery, metallic scent into the humid air. Trembling, he touched it lightly, and a shiver ran through him as the skin rippled unnaturally, like a living membrane, reacting to his fingers' pressure. A soft, wet squelch echoed again, this time louder, synchronized with the pounding of his pulse, and for a horrifying second, it almost sounded like a whisper, a low, guttural sigh emanating from inside his own leg. Marcus stumbled back, heart racing, almost vomiting from the combined stench and the creeping, visceral sense of violation, his own body betraying him in ways he could not comprehend. Sleep offered no reprieve. Every position brought sharp pains, a sensation of crawling, a low crackling beneath the skin that seemed to move in unpredictable patterns. Shadows across the room appeared alive, stretching toward him, and even the patter of rain outside seemed intensified, like fingernails tapping insistently against the window, mocking his helplessness. Desperate, he searched online for anything resembling his symptoms, scrolling past pages of grotesque infections, necrotic wounds, gangrene, and parasites, each image twisting his stomach and increasing the gnawing fear. Nothing matched exactly, and the more he read, the more impossible the situation seemed. He considered visiting a doctor, yet fear rooted him in place. What if no one believed him? What if he was labeled insane? Days passed, and the swelling worsened. The blackened area now had small ridges, uneven elevations beneath the skin that moved slowly but unmistakably, as if something was pushing against the surface from the inside. The pus thickened, forming dark clumps that smelled worse than before, the metallic stench pervasive enough to stick to the walls of his apartment. Marcus avoided friends, pretending to be busy, making excuses to cancel plans. When he glimpsed his reflection in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. The knee seemed alien, monstrous, a cavernous deformity where skin, black and red, pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. Every step sent waves of pain, a wet, squelching sound echoing faintly with each movement, audible only to him, amplifying the paranoia that the lesion was alive and aware. Nightmares consumed him, visions of the wound widening, threads or tendrils snaking out from the blackened center, reaching under his clothing, grasping at his flesh. He woke screaming, hands pressed to the throbbing mass, tasting iron and rot in his mouth, sweat slicking his body, unable to tell where dream ended and reality began. His apartment grew suffocating, the stale smell of coffee and humidity replaced by the pungent stench of his own disease, a reminder that his body had become a prison. Alone, he considered drastic measures. Amputation, cauterization, anything to stop the movement he could feel under the skin, but the thought paralyzed him. The lesion seemed to sense his hesitation, pulsating more vigorously, swelling slightly at his gaze, as though mocking his fear. Finally, driven to desperation, he made an appointment with a local physician, Dr. Ellen Ward, a general practitioner known for her thoroughness. Entering the clinic, he felt a fragile hope, mixed with terror, each step sending pain waves up his leg. Dr. Ward greeted him warmly, noticing the pallor of his face, the awkward gait he tried to disguise. Marcus rolled up his pant leg to reveal the full extent of the lesion. Dr. Ward's eyes widened, but she maintained professional composure, leaning in carefully, inhaling faintly the sickly metallic odor that hung around him. "We'll need to act quickly," she said, a note of urgency threading her calm voice. Marcus felt a shred of relief, a fragile lifeline in the darkness consuming him. As she examined him more closely, he noticed something truly horrifying. The blackened, red mound seemed to shift subtly under her fingers, the ridges moving independently, almost purposefully, sending waves of dread up his spine. He wanted to scream, to pull away, but he trusted her instinctively. She whispered instructions, guiding him gently toward a procedure she promised would remove the infection, the mass, whatever this thing had become. As he was wheeled into a dimly lit treatment room, the sound of soft squelching beneath his knee echoed louder than ever, a wet, deliberate rhythm, synchronized with his pulse. Marcus clutched the gurney, dread clawing at his chest, knowing that what awaited was uncertain. He glanced at Dr. Ward, a beacon of hope amid the horror, and for a moment, almost believed he might survive. Then, as the anesthesia began to take hold, a sudden, grotesque movement beneath the skin erupted, a subtle bulge extending outward like a pulse of life independent of his own, and a wet, sucking noise resonated from the lesion, impossibly loud, filling the room. Marcus's eyes widened in terror, heart hammering as darkness claimed him, the echo of a whisper brushing against his mind, indistinct but unmistakable, as if the thing inside him recognized him and was awake. When Marcus awoke, the faint antiseptic smell of the clinic did little to calm him. The room was dim, sterile, and yet carried a subtle undertone of decay, as if the shadows themselves exhaled faintly of rot. Dr. Ward stood at the foot of the gurney, checking his vital signs with a calm precision that did little to soothe the gnawing panic within him. The pain in his leg was immediate and searing, a white-hot blaze beneath the skin that refused to be dulled even by the lingering effects of anesthesia. His first instinct was to roll onto his side, but the wound beneath his knee, now grotesque and swelling beyond recognition, protested violently. Even through the bandages, he could feel the irregular, almost conscious movements of the lesion, as though it had a mind separate from his own. The skin around it was blackened and streaked with deep crimson, oozing a thick, sticky pus that carried the metallic tang he had come to associate with fear. The black and red mass seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, sending rhythmic jolts up his thigh, a terrifying symphony of movement beneath the surface. Despite the bandages and antiseptic ointments Dr. Ward had applied, Marcus could feel the subtle undulations beneath the skin, the sensation of something alive and aware wriggling in a confined space. He squeezed his eyes shut, tasting the iron tang of panic on his tongue, and tried to focus on the doctor's voice. Dr. Ward's hands were steady as she adjusted his fore, her words precise and measured, but every subtle movement of her fingers over the dressing made the lesion beneath twitch violently, a silent protest that made Marcus shiver uncontrollably. He tried to speak, to ask what exactly she had done, but the sound of his own voice cracked in his throat, wet and metallic, leaving him choking on saliva that tasted faintly of rust. Over the next few hours, the lesion became increasingly insistent, the wriggling feeling growing stronger, almost purposeful. Marcus could hear faint, wet crackling noises that seemed to emanate from beneath the skin, synchronized with his pulse yet independent, a sinister rhythm that mocked him. He tried to focus on his surroundings, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. But every sound seemed amplified, distorted, as if the clinic itself were alive and complicit in his torment. When Dr. Ward returned, she lifted the bandages slightly to examine the wound, and Marcus nearly recoiled in horror. The lesion had transformed further. The black and red surface was no longer just a blotch. It now bulged into irregular, writhing ridges that moved beneath the skin with disturbing intent. Tiny pustules dotted the surface, releasing a thick, yellowish fluid with every subtle flex of his leg. The metallic stench was overpowering, clinging to the edges of his consciousness like a dark fog. Marcus tried to look away, but he could not escape the sight. The skin seemed alive, pulsing and twisting, almost breathing, and he could swear he saw faint, black tendrils moving beneath the translucent layers of flesh, exploring, probing, searching. Dr. Ward's expression remained composed, but her eyes flickered briefly with concern as she noted the rapid deterioration. "This is beyond typical infection," she murmured, almost to herself, "but we'll try to contain it." Marcus wanted to scream, to beg her to stop, but the words would not come. Instead, he felt a deep, visceral revulsion toward his own body, a horror that made him want to claw away at the flesh, to remove himself from the thing that had become alien. In the following days, Marcus's life became a blur of hospital visits, antiseptic smells, and endless procedures that offered only temporary relief. Each time, Dr. Ward debrided the lesion, removed necrotic tissue, or applied experimental ointments, the black and red mass would recede slightly, only to return with renewed vigor, spreading along the contours of his knee, sending sharp, writhing pulses of pain upward into his thigh. The pus thickened and darkened, sticky and foul, leaving trails that clung to his clothes and sheets, the smell impossible to mask. Every night, he awoke drenched in sweat, listening to the squelching movements beneath his skin, tasting iron and decay, feeling as though the lesion were actively probing his nerves, asserting dominion over his flesh. His sense of self began to fray. Walking through his apartment, he felt disconnected from his limbs, as though the leg with the lesion were no longer his own, but some other creature tethered to him by sinew and bone. Mirrors became instruments of terror. The reflection staring back was still recognizably him, yet distorted, alien, a man betrayed by his own body. The once familiar apartment now seemed hostile, the shadows stretching and twisting with malevolent intent, the rain outside a constant reminder of the relentless, unfeeling passage of time. Marcus tried to reach out to friends, but isolation had crept into his life like a silent predator. Calls went unanswered, texts ignored, and even the few who responded seemed disturbed by the metallic tang that clung to his clothing or by the trembling, uneven gait he could not hide. In moments of unbearable pain, he would look at his knee, fascinated and horrified, tracing the uneven ridges with trembling fingers, feeling the pulse of life that was not his own beneath the skin. Occasionally, he swore he heard whispers, low and guttural, emanating from the lesion itself, incomprehensible but insistently directed at him, repeating fragments of his name in a wet, sucking cadence. Fear became a constant companion, gnawing at him as much as the lesion did, and he began to question his own mind. Was the lesion alive? Was it sentient? Was he losing himself entirely to this grotesque parasite? Dr. Ward remained the only anchor in the storm, insisting that treatment was ongoing, that containment and careful excision could give him chance. Yet every intervention revealed new horrors. Beneath each layer of necrotic tissue lay deeper blackened veins, threads of pus-filled sacs, and ridges that twitched with almost intentional awareness. One evening, as Marcus lay on the hospital bed, he caught sight of the lesion through the thin bandages, and his stomach lurched. A small, wet bulge had emerged, black and glistening, twitching slowly, almost like an eye opening, observing. He froze, unable to breathe, every nerve screaming, the metallic stench filling the room, overwhelming the antiseptic. Dr. Ward, noticing his pale, trembling face, leaned in close, her calm voice anchoring him. "Marcus, I know it's terrifying, but you are not alone. We can stop this." Marcus wanted to believe her, but the lesion pulsed beneath the bandages with renewed vigor, sending a wet, sucking noise through the air as though mocking her words. That night, alone in the dim hospital room after she left, Marcus felt the crawling intensify, the squelching wetness beneath his skin now unmistakable in rhythm and intent. He could no longer ignore it. Fingers of movement, thin as hair yet strong, shifted beneath the flesh, probing, stretching, pressing against his nerves, and he realized with a cold, visceral horror that his knee, the black and red mass, the grotesque mound of pus and flesh, was not just a symptom but a separate entity, awake and aware. Every twitch and shift was accompanied by the faintest of sounds, a wet squelch, a subtle whispering that seemed to resonate directly into his mind. He could feel something alive beneath. The skin, something that understood him, recognized him, yet remained utterly alien. Sleep was impossible. The lesion's movement kept him teetering on the edge of madness, a constant reminder that his body was no longer entirely his. Days blurred into nights, pain and revulsion becoming a continuous loop. Marcus tried to walk, to escape the claustrophobic confines of the hospital, but each step sent searing jolts through his leg, the black and red mass pulsing with purpose, almost hungry. Even simple touch caused the ridges to writhe violently beneath the skin, releasing small, sticky beads of pus that smelled of iron and decay. He could no longer distinguish where his pain ended and the lesions began. One evening, alone in his sterile hospital room, he lifted the bandages for the first time in hours, drawn by morbid curiosity and terror. What he saw made his stomach convulse. The lesion had grown larger, swelling grotesquely, the black and red surface punctuated by tiny ridges that twisted and flexed as if alive. Pus oozed slowly, forming thick rivulets down his calf. But it was the subtle twitching, the rhythmic pulse that suggested intelligence, that made his mind shatter for a moment. The lesion was aware. It responded to his gaze, shifting slightly, expanding and contracting with deliberate intent. Marcus recoiled, vomiting into the stainless steel basin by his bed, tasting bile mixed with the coppery tang of blood and decay. Tears streaked his pale face as he tried to tell himself it was impossible, that this was only infection, only inflammation, but his body screamed betrayal. Over the following week, Dr. Ward continued her interventions. Each procedure revealed deeper horrors, thin black threads beneath the skin, pulsating and twisting, oozing yellow-green pus that smelled strongly of rot. Marcus was confined mostly to bed, unable to walk without sharp, writhing pain, every movement punctuated by wet, squelching sounds emanating from his knee. His mind became increasingly fragile, fracturing under the combination of relentless physical torment and the existential dread of his own betrayal by flesh. At times, he heard whispers in the lesion, faint words he could not fully comprehend, sometimes a mocking repetition of his own name, sometimes phrases that hinted at guilt, shame, or punishment. The whispers were accompanied by the sensation of probing, as though the lesion were exploring his nerves, testing the limits of his endurance, asserting dominion over him. He had nightmares in which the lesion consumed him, spreading black and red tendrils over his body, pulling him into darkness, suffocating him in a living membrane that squelched and pulsed. Each dream ended in the same wet, sucking noise, resonating in his mind even after waking, leaving him trembling, disoriented, and terrified. Social contact had all but ceased. Friends and colleagues no longer called, deterred perhaps by his absence or the faint, metallic stench that clung to his clothing. Marcus barely spoke, whispering only to Dr. Ward, the single person who seemed capable of anchoring him to reality. Even she admitted privately that this was unprecedented, that no known infection or lesion behaved with such deliberate awareness. Marcus felt both relief and dread. Relief that someone cared, dread that she might fail, and that the lesion's sentience was uncontainable. One evening, after a particularly excruciating session of cleaning and dressing, Marcus stared down at his knee. The black and red mound now bulged grotesquely, ridges flexing and twitching, pus glistening along its surface, and the faintest whispering seemed to emanate from deep within, synchronized with his heartbeat. Panic clawed at him, and he realized with cold clarity that he was no longer simply afflicted. He was host, vessel, prisoner, and perhaps accomplice to something alive that had claimed dominion over his flesh. He wanted to scream, to destroy it, but knew that any interference would only provoke it further. Dr. Ward had been his only hope, the single lifeline in a reality that had become alien, but Marcus now understood that he was at the mercy of this sentient lesion, that it had become an integral part of him, and that its desires, its will, and its presence were inescapable. That night, as rain pattered relentlessly against the hospital window, Marcus lay awake, trembling, tasting iron and bile, listening to the wet, subtle squelching beneath his skin and the soft, incomprehensible whispers that had become the soundtrack of his existence. He knew, with absolute certainty, that his body was no longer his own, and yet he was powerless, trapped in a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. He felt it move again, subtly, gently, but unmistakably aware, beneath the black and red surface, and a chill ran through his spine as he whispered into the darkness, asking questions he knew would never be answered. And in the darkness, the lesion pulsed, alive, patient, and waiting. Marcus awoke to a darkness that seemed to press against him, thick and suffocating, the antiseptic sterility of the clinic, now tainted with the unmistakable stench of rot and iron that clung to his skin like a second layer of existence. The lesion beneath his knee, once a grotesque black and red mass, had swollen further, a living topography of writhing ridges, pulsating veins, and glistening pustules that oozed thick, sticky pus with every subtle movement of his leg. The wet, sucking sounds it emitted were no longer intermittent. They filled the room, a chorus synchronized with his heartbeat, each pulse accompanied by sharp, probing movements beneath the flesh that sent jolts of terror up his spine. He dared not lift the bandages, yet a compulsion, a terrible curiosity, forced him to glance beneath the sterile cloth. The sight made his stomach twist violently. The lesion now resembled a miniature, grotesque creature embedded within his skin, ridges curling like blackened tendrils, tiny pustules opening and closing as if breathing, and a faint, glistening slit at its center that moved rhythmically, as if observing him. Marcus could feel it, an intelligent awareness pressing against his nerves, probing, testing, asserting dominion over his leg, over his very body. The pain was relentless, sharp and writhing, a constant reminder that his flesh was no longer entirely his own. He tried to move, to escape, but each step sent wet, wriggling pulses up his thigh, the lesion reacting as if aware of his intentions, tugging him back into helplessness. Dr. Ward entered, her face calm, but Marcus saw the brief flicker of concern in her eyes as she approached. "Marcus, I need to examine it again," she said softly, her voice the only tether to reality. He tried to protest, but the words died in his throat, choked by the metallic tang of fear that filled his mouth. As she gently lifted the bandages, the lesion seemed to react, ridges curling and twisting violently, expelling a thick, black and red secretion that splattered onto the sterile sheets. Marcus gagged, retching, the smell of decay and iron overwhelming the antiseptic air. Dr. Ward worked methodically, her hands deft and steady, but even she could not hide the faint tremor in her touch as she debrided the necrotic tissue. Beneath the surface, Marcus could see something that made his blood run cold. Thin, black tendrils moving independently beneath the skin, exploring, stretching, and weaving through the networks of his veins and nerves. For the first time, he understood with gut-wrenching clarity that the lesion was not merely a disease. It was a sentient parasite, alive and deliberate, consuming, probing, and reshaping him from the inside out. The hours stretched endlessly, a blur of pain, pus, and wet, wriggling movements beneath his flesh. Each procedure offered only temporary relief. The lesion rebounded with renewed intensity, swelling further, expanding its reach, sending tendrils higher up his thigh, blackened veins. Marcus felt the first fragile stirrings of hope when Dr. Ward returned the next morning, her presence a tether to reality amid the chaos of his body. She had insisted on a more aggressive treatment, a combination of surgical debridement and experimental topical compounds she had been developing in secret for cases that defied conventional medicine. As she prepared the operating area, Marcus's leg throbbed violently, the black and red lesion pulsing and twisting with sentient awareness, as if anticipating the intrusion. The smell of rot and iron mixed with the antiseptic of the clinic, creating a nauseating cocktail that made him gag even as he tried to focus on the sterile instruments. The procedure began with precision, Dr. Ward's hands moving deftly over the swelling, peeling away necrotic tissue while the lesion writhed and hissed in protest, wet tendrils recoiling and then surging forward again as if testing her boundaries. Each incision released a burst of thick, foul-smelling pus, black streaks mingling with red, coating the sterile sheets, and Marcus could feel the movements beneath his skin shift and twist like live threads pulling at his nerves. Pain seared through him, sharp and writhing, yet the lesion's size and aggression began to diminish slightly under the combined assault. Dr. Ward worked tirelessly, sweat beading on her forehead, the wet squelches and rhythmic pulsations of the mass echoing in Marcus's skull, a grotesque symphony that blurred the line between relief and horror. When the procedure concluded, she applied a thick, viscous ointment that steamed slightly against the damaged flesh, sealing what remained of the lesion while sending a shiver of chemical heat through his nerves. Marcus lay back, trembling, tasting copper and bile as he realized the lesion had receded slightly, the pulsing now intermittent rather than constant, the blackened ridges less pronounced. For the first time in days, he dared to breathe without immediate violent pain. Dr. Ward assured him that the procedure had bought them time, that the worst of the parasitic aggression had been contained, but her calm tone could not entirely mask the worry in her eyes, the subtle tremor in her fingers as she applied fresh bandages. Marcus tried to walk later that day, carefully testing his weight, and though every step sent a shudder through his leg, the writhing had diminished to faint, wet pulsations beneath the skin. He felt relief mingled with lingering dread, a tenuous balance that left him acutely aware of the fragility of his new normal. Returning home, he attempted to resume fragments of routine, checking mail, sipping tepid coffee, avoiding mirrors that might betray the slightest remaining deformity. The lesion, though diminished, reminded him with every twitch, every subtle pulse beneath the bandages, that was still alive, still sentient, still part of him. At night, as he lay in his apartment smelling the lingering metallic tang and the faint residue of decay, he pressed his hand to the bandaged knee, feeling the faintest wriggle and a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure that made his stomach knot. He understood that what Dr. Ward had achieved was not a cure, merely containment, and the lesion's awareness had not been diminished. It had only adapted, retreating to bide its time. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams where his leg twisted impossibly, ridges of black and red flesh opening to reveal tiny, glistening orifices that whispered in wet, gurgling tones, echoing fragments of his own thoughts back at him. He awoke each time with a metallic taste in his mouth and the unshakable sensation that the lesion was observing, calculating, waiting. The temporary reprieve gave him a fragile sense of agency, a belief that he might regain some semblance of control over his body and his life. Yet every twitch beneath the bandages, every faint hiss of movement, reminded him that the sentience he fought had not been vanquished, only postponed. By the end of the 5th day, Marcus had learned to walk cautiously, to interact briefly with neighbors, to reintroduce fragments of human contact without exposing the grotesque reality beneath his clothing. Still, the lesion pulsed beneath the bandages, a persistent, wet reminder of the horror he carried within. And as he lay awake listening to the hum of the city outside, the rain streaking the window like tears, he realized that this fragile hope was only temporary, a reprieve in a war that had no clear end, a pause in the relentless, sentient decay that threatened to consume not just his body, but his very identity.